All right, great. So my name is Glenda Lindsay. I'm the Management and Program Analyst, or otherwise known as Incident Business Lead for the BLM Fire and Aviation Management for Oregon and Washington. I've been qualified as a Finance Section Chief and Incident Business Advisor for the last 6 years. I started my career in 2008 with the Tiller Ranger Station, and there's quite a few people that started there. I was a services supervisor when I first started, and then immediately had to start learning about federal budgets and processes. Um, I've worked for mostly the Forest Service and the BLM in the last 16 years. I had a little stint with NRCS, which was the National Resource Conservation Service, and worked really on a program that spent a lot of money buying conservation leases and having those um, redeveloped into what they used to be in prior to development. So in the BLM, I've been with the BLM for about 6.5 years in different positions, incident business, mostly budget some, and all of the positions I've held in the federal government have been had a component of budget with it. So um, I've been in it for a while, and as we see today, we have a lot of things change every time we have a different administration. Our budgets suddenly are reviewed and looked at, and then so it's quite a struggle. So at sometimes, and then other times we're good. So I'm going to talk to you about the federal wildland fire budget today. And if you have any questions, you can wait till the end, or you can raise your hand at any time. I'll try to keep a lookout, but perhaps some of the coaches could look out and maybe call them out if they see hands. Oops. Let's see if this works. All right. So as I might have alluded to, we go through agency budget cycles, and we look at our objectives are the agency budget cycles, laws, policies, and business rules, and then appropriate use of different funding types. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. Um, oh, shoot. I don't know if that is covering that up. Okay. So as we're learning right now, the White House Office of Management and Budget, they develop the guidance, which is funneled down to the bureau levels. The bureau and agencies develop proposed budgets, which are funneled back up through the administration and to Congress with the budget justifications. And then the Congress develops the budget based on the input from administration and its own policy and fiscal goals. So we'll probably start seeing some of that happening shortly with the change in administration. And then our agencies all take the internal process to allocate those funds. Any questions on that? So what typically happens is usually we'll have a fiscal year begin with a continuing resolution. And that continuing resolution always has a time attached to it, but they either get a new budget, or they continue on in continuing resolutions. No new programs may start until a budget is finalized. So that's really important to us. And what sometimes happens is Congress and the president do not agree, and then we have a partial government shutdown until agreement is reached. Annual appropriations. So as we talked about, they come from they come up way higher than any of us, and they come down through Congress. And this one shows the DOI as opposed to the Forest Service. So two different agencies coming down through the Department of Interior for the BLM to the four different agencies. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, BLM, and the Park Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And then the Forest Service goes directly down through the Forest Service, and they get to regional, state office, and then the field units. Wildfire funding execution. So we have an integrated approach, and um, we all work really hard to make sure that we're prepared for fire season, and that's the preparedness funds, the fuels management, fire science, those funds before. And then during a fire, we use our suppression operations, emergency stabilization, and fire science. And then after we switch over to burned area rehabilitation and continue with fire science. So we have a chart that kind of describes the use of the different funds. Preparedness funds are very specific to uh, preparing for fire season. And we can only use those in specific ways, and they provide an integrated and coordinated framework for wildfire response by giving us those preparedness funds for core firefighting resources and managing the capacity of assets and operations. So, and that's across the United States. And then, of course, when we get into suppression operations, we have specific things we can spend our suppression operations on. And those can be very wide. So if we're suppressing a fire, we're going to go out there and we're going to use our funds how we need to use them to suppress that fire. As long as we're following the policies and procedures, we have Red Book, which states our procedures. We've got Yellow Book. I guess we'll flip over to that slide here in a minute, but we have policies and procedures that direct us how to use the funds. And then we have fuels management. Of course, fuels management is a little outside of the fire program in that they represent the strategic investment in, in managing veg and to reduce wildfire intensity. So we get a lot of funds through fuels management also, and those folks go out and put that mechanical, chemical, biological treatments and other methods to clean up the landscape and get ready for fires and manage. So here is a slide on post-wildfire funding, which after the year I've had is really near and dear to my heart. Suppression repair are funds that are used to repair suppression damages. So if we're out and the fire burns over the landscape and destroys fences, that is not what suppression repair is about. And those fences, sadly, they were burned by the fire, and sadly, suppression dollars are not meant to repair those. So suppression repair is for damage due to suppression activities. And we use those usually while teams are there, try to get those funds used, get that repair done right away if we can, or immediately after containment. It can take a little longer. And if it goes past the fiscal year, the Forest Service requires a letter through their regional forester before they can continue to use suppression funds.
Glenda, we had a question for that the last
Sure.
slide, sorry. Could you talk to how Office of Wildland Fire fits into that budget process? OWF.
Sure. Office of Wildland Fire is up at the DOI. I'm probably going to say it not exactly correct, but Office of Wildland Fire fits between the DOI and the other DOI agencies. So we've got DOI, and they have an Office of Wildland Fire that um, works with our funds and then pushes them down through the BLM or the Fish and Wildlife Park Service or BIA for their use, and they direct us on how to use our preparedness, suppression, or fuels funds. Did that
Thank you.
answer the question?
You got it. Thank you in
Okay,
the
great.
chat there.
Oh, I don't have chat up. Sorry. And so suppression repair, Responsibility for suppression repair is the IC and the agency administrator. Agency administrators, you guys have a lot of responsibility when it comes to how we spend our funds and the appropriate use of spending our funds. So I always want to just give us that you will usually have an incident business advisor on your fires to help you that it's their job to actually know the appropriate use of these funds. Sometimes we're still learning and we have a lot to learn, but we always have a backup or a phone a friend. And we work really hard to make sure that we're giving you good advice on what's appropriate for expense of these funds. So just want to put that plug in there for you. Emergency stabilization, that's to protect life and property. That happens after the fire. It's post wildfire, up to 1 to 12 months usually. And again, the agency administrator is responsible for those funds. Rehab, that's to repair damages. And those damages due to fire, and you usually have 1 to 5 years to use those funds. And again, it's the agency administrator who's the responsibility. And it's rehabilitation or regular program funding. It is not suppression funding. And then restoration is long-term ecosystem restoration. It's to take care of what damage the fire caused. It's up to 5 years or 5 years plus, I guess. And the agency administrator, once again, is responsible for the appropriate use of those funds. And those come from your regular program funds. So it's really important to understand the differences between the funds and how they can be used. Because you guys really have a big load on your shoulders when it comes to making those decisions around what you can do and how those funds are used. And then our references, this is what the INBAs use. This is what all the fire folks use to the guidance on how we do these things comes out through the Red Book. And I've given you a link here, which is, it's the Interagency Standards for Fire and Aviation Operations. The BLM is Chapter 2. We have a full chapter. The Forest Service, I don't know their chapter, but they have a full chapter as well as the other DOI agencies. So if it's specific to the agency, it's in those chapters. If it's overall, it's in the Chapter 1, I believe. So just take a look at that. The Yellow Book, which is the NWCG standards for interagency incident business management, that's the one that you'll find the finance folks use, mostly the incident business advisors. That's the interagency book. For the BLM, we have the same thing that's specific to BLM. We call it the Orange Book. And then in policy, the Forest Service has a handbook, which is the 6509.11, which is where you'll find the policy on how to spend Forest Service funds. And then, of course, the government budget process is on USA.gov. And then the president's budget, I gave you a link to that also. So I think it's a pretty short presentation, but meant to have a lot of discussion if you have any questions.
Hey, Glenda, we do have one other question in the chat here. What do you mean by regular program? What if you don't have an in-house fire program?
That's a great question. And I don't know which agency doesn't have an in-house fire program. Not really sure who that's coming from. If I could.
That came from me. So what I meant by in-house is like our station is only part of a bigger fire program, and we don't have fire funds come directly to our refuge.
I see. So if you don't have a preparedness budget in your station, do they fight fire there, or if something happens, then folks come from all over to help out?
And we're part of an interagency group.
Mhm.
And our regional office does provide some funds kind of just for some positions and for doing the administration for us in-house. We only have a couple of collateral duty firefighters. But I guess what I'm getting at is when you say regular program, I was thinking like that's our what we call MC, management capability, and that's what we would do with regular projects, like if it was, doing some wildlife survey or something.
So, I really can't speak to your program in that way. Most, the BLM and the Forest Service and some of your refuges do get some preparedness funds, so they're ready when they do have a fire, if they have fire folks. So, um, like if you have a fire crew that's there on your refuge or engines or those kind of things, the regular funds or what supports those. Sorry, I wasn't being very inclusive when I said regular funds.
Thank you, though. It's good.
Okay, now I can see the chat. On interagency fires with both Forest Service and BLM, does one handbook supersede the other? So no. Each agency has to follow their own policies, but we have at a higher level, we have a master agreement in the GAC. And then we have an agency operating plan in the GAC. And those are what we use for interagency, but also on your in your local unit, you may have a local operating plan that also would spell out how your what policies you're following. You're welcome. Any other questions or just conversation? All right. Pretty short presentation.
All right. Thanks, Glenda. If any other questions do come up, please drop them in the chat and we'll follow up on that. But we'll just go ahead and move on to Matt. He's going to continue on the wildland fire budget side of things. And he's going to talk specifically to the state of ODF.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully Glenda can stick around for a little bit. If there's any stuff that I say that triggers some conversation stuff. But anyway, my name is Matt Hona. I work for the Oregon Department of Forestry out of Northeast Oregon. My day job is an assistant district forester. Been part of this cadre for a couple years with the steering committee and others. I will preface this talk. I am not a finance section chief. I am not an IBA. I don't have a background in financial services with the agency, but I do work. Annually in our fiscal budgeting system, building that fiscal budget for the local district, and then also helping on some committee group stuff statewide involved with ODF. So I'm going to kind of give a bigger overview about, at least on the state side, just what ODF kind of how we budget and how we're kind of set up financially. And so I'll start with the fact that for our protection budgets, they start at the local district level. And so we've got 13 districts and associations across the state of Oregon. We put together our fiscal budget based on our personnel and S&S and what we think we're going to spend on readiness. And so this is all kind of a readiness budget. And that translates into, depending on how many acres we protect in that district, it comes out to a rate per acre. And why that's important is our funding is set up so that the landowners pay in that district 50% of that budget, and then we get a general fund match for the other 50%. So, and those per acre rates can vary depending on the level of protection and the cost of protection, et cetera, in the varying districts throughout the state. So that adds a pretty good complexity to our system, but it also really feeds the landowner portion. They're directly involved in our budgeting process at the local level and highly influenced over what kind of what we are doing, and it keeps them very tied to what the agency's mission is there. And so that's our readiness side is kind of think of it as kind of a 50-50 generally 50-50 split between landowners and general fund. So all those district budgets get rolled up. We have our protection division, which is our agency protection division in Salem headquarters. They also have their budget, and that gets rolled into and then divided out per district. So all of the districts kind of pay for that Salem headquarters services protection division. And so all of that to say that's 100% on the readiness side. When it comes to large fire, we have the Oregon Forest Protection Land, or Oregon. I'll get the OLFPF, so I have to dig out the acronym. So Oregon Forest Land Protection Fund, which is funded by, it's also funded by the landowners through in addition to their assessment. And it's also, there's a general fund match to that as well. And so I believe the landowner fund is about 10 million bucks, and I think they have another 10 million on top of that from the general fund to give us a total of $20 million to fight large fires. And as you guys know, that might pay for a fire in a fire season. You might get lucky and it might pay for a fire and a half or two, but it's pretty easy to spend 20 million bucks in a fire season. And on average, I think we're up into the 80 to 100 million dollar fire seasons now. And last year we broke a record, and we had a little over $320 million in fire suppression costs, gross costs up front. And so the state of Oregon doesn't have any money to fight fire, or at least ODF. I'll say ODF does not have any money to fight fire after that $20 million. In years past, we had a insurance through Lloyd's of London that we carried for another 50 plus million. But over time, that premium price has driven us out of that business. And so the challenge for the state, at least for the state of Oregon, is how is the state going to pay for the rest of the fire season? That our gross costs were in the 320 million range. I think our net costs are in the 120 million range, and that's after FEMA reimbursements and cost shares get settled and all of those things. But the reality is that the state of Oregon has to hang on to those costs and pay those bills up front to the tune of 320 million until we get those reimbursements from FEMA and cost shares from the Forest Service, BLM, et cetera. And so that's kind of a big picture snapshot. I'm going through the last year's presentation to see if there's any other highlights. I don't know if Glenda's still here. We can talk about cost share stuff. But typically, for the state system, we base everything on actual costs. And so our accounting either gets audited at the FEMA level, which they account to the penny, or it's getting audited by our emergency fire cost committee that manages the OLFPF. And so our audit stuff is very critical, just like it is on the federal side. And so after the 2024 fire season, we're still paying bills and we're still trying to settle cost shares, and that work continues today, and it's not going to be done anytime soon. Glenda put something in there about suppression repair. I think we're very similar on the ODF side with suppression repair. If it's something that we damaged or broke during the suppression of the fire, we will handle suppression repair, but we're not rehabilitating things later. Generally, when it comes to damage that the fire did to the natural cover, et cetera. I think Friday we've got another talk on post-fire recovery that we'll probably get into some more details there on what we can and can't do. But suppression repair typically falls. Well, Glenn, I'll be corrected here. Does it fall within a cost share or not?
Suppression repair, we can share the equipment or folks doing the repair in the cost share. But anything that we purchase specifically for doing that repair is not shared. It's based on, whether it's private or whose protection it is, actually.
Yeah. So there's a comment about the fence stuff. So if we push through a fence with a dozer, yes, we're going to repair that. But if a fire burns up, wooden fence posts, that's going to be, the landowners typically getting on the hook for that. And what we do have is under the post-fire recovery, there are other opportunities to not be so financially impactful on landowners, I would say. And I don't want to spoil that discussion, but we do get other dollars available to do post-fire recovery stuff, either on the forest land or on other infrastructure that was damaged during the fire. It's another pot of money that comes in to do that stuff later. But to Glenda's point, I think the suppression repair that we can do up front while the INTs are still there is critical to have. If we can get 80 or 90% of that work done up front, and we can spend 3 months to 6 months or 8 months trying to get the other 20% done later, figure out who's going to pay for that. That's a lot easier than waiting, getting 10 or 20% done up front and then having a really big workload later. So yeah. And Eric, did you have something?
Yeah, I was going to ask. So, for a question here, so as a state, talking about state budget here, what are those considerations that a federal agency administrator or fire management officer should really think about when they're thinking about suppression, preparedness, severity, post-fire, like what those differences?
So for ODF, the mission right up front is to minimize cost and minimize loss. And so minimizing acreage is typically how we would minimize the overall cost of a fire. A small fire is typically cheaper than a large fire, generally speaking. And so, back to the comment earlier today, you spend a lot of money up front on IA. If you can keep that fire small, it's actually a lot easier to do a cost share. You're looking at maybe some reciprocal stuff, or maybe a couple days of some crews and some equipment, and typically aircraft is really the big one there on those shorter fires from initial attack, and that would translate into us minimizing our cost, minimizing acres burnt for that private landowner. The thing to remember for ODF is, by and large, we protect not exclusively private land, but because we do protect some public land. There is the BLM West Side Agreement, the WOOP, the Western Oregon Operating Plan, where ODF protects the BLM land under contract, I think from about, Salem, Eugene, south, I think all the way down to the Southern Oregon. So they protect a lot of that BLM ground under contract. We're trying to minimize our costs when it comes to fighting fire, and because by and large, out of our 15 or 16 million acres that we protect, I think 10 or 12 of those are private land, like either an industrial forest landowner, and a lot of them, especially in Eastern Oregon, are not industrial forest lands. They're all small forest landowners that could have 10 acres and a few trees to a couple hundred acres, and they're managing for different objectives. And so that's the biggest difference, is those private landowners that we're actively working for.
I think, Matt, you covered most of the federal government does the same for federal government property. In most cases, they're protecting federal property. Of course, the federal government is gonna, if they have the resources, and they're gonna step out and they're gonna try to protect private property. If a fire's coming that way and they have the resources there, they're gonna do that. But that's not our main mission. Our mission is federal property. And but we have a master agreement. We have the agency operating plan, where we work closely with our states and try to make sure we minimize the fires and minimize the damage that can be caused by those.
I see a couple of questions in the chat. Dan, you're getting around prescribed fire. Is that for me or Glenn? I'm assuming that's for me. So as of late, ODF has not really had a prescribed fire program in 20, we'll get the dates wrong, 2020, 2021. We, you know, with Bill 762, we did start a prescribed fire kind of, I think we're dipping our toe into that. I would put it that way. So we're coming up with policy in order to implement prescribed fire, both for the ability for a landowner to implement prescribed fire on their property and utilize or utilize ODF as that service. Obviously that would be a separate pool of money. They didn't create a new pool of money to say, hey, here's your prescribed fire budget and go do that. So we're still working through kind of the details on what that is. The main thing up front was trying to figure out landowner liability. The really weird thing with prescribed fire is even if a landowner hires out a prescribed or wants to do a prescribed fire, that landowner is liable for any spread off of that property onto adjacent properties and can be held liable in a court. And so it's really to figure out the landowner liability piece. It is kind of the big priority. If we can sort that out, then we can kind of work towards implementation. And I don't know if that really answers your question or not, but I'll give you a minute to come on and I'll try to take a stab at the next one. Are there landscapes in your protection where you could say fire is not completely incompatible? I would say that there's a lot of areas where fire is compatible, so not incompatible, I think is a way to answer that. But again, we don't really have that program up and running where we can implement a prescribed fire. If we're doing burnout stuff on an incident where we're using fire to fight fire, that's one thing. But just to do a blanket prescribed fire, our goal downstream is to get into some of the cross boundary stuff, utilizing some other partnerships to help landowners achieve objectives that would tie in with adjacent federal fuels projects. And so I think that's the big picture downstream where we want to get to. But right now we're still kind of in the infancy of our prescribed fire program within ODF. Are there any other questions? I don't see any other questions in the chat. Sorry for the double negative. Yeah. Not incompatible. So I like that. We touched a little bit on cost shares, documentation. As I mentioned, we do have all of our stuff has to either pass a internal audit with our EFCC or an external audit with FEMA. So we're very conscious about those things. We do have our own, ODF is a signatory on the Viper system, so we can procure and utilize Viper resources. I believe that's still correct. We also have our own incident resource agreements, IRAs. If you hear of those, at least on the Oregon side, I don't know what they do in Washington, probably something similar. But we have incident resource agreements that we have with vendors to hire that equipment, and so we don't have the restrictions necessarily. We can grab a lot of local stuff and keep local stuff around. And one of the things that we've really found locally, at least within our footprint, ordering resources is we have the ability to procure some stuff that the feds cannot. And vice versa, the feds have some ability to procure some stuff that ODF cannot. And so we've really tried to leverage what each of the agencies can bring to the table on, especially on a cost share fire or something where we're sharing resources. Because we got a whole nother, slew of resources that would be available to us that can help with incident management. I think that kind of touches on agreements and IRAs. I don't know if we want to get into cost share methodologies or anything like that. We can, but that's kind of, for the agency administrators, that's probably a little bit more in your wheelhouse on how we would typically do things. Usually a acreage split or a percent of effort would be the two typical ones, but you can pretty much do whatever you want. It just, the more complex you make a cost share, the more complex it is for the finance folks to sort out later. And I think a lot of the agency administrators, at least, I think, have tumbled to simplicity. Let's try to keep things as simple as we can so that because, this last year I can count up, at least in my district in Northeast Oregon, I think we rolled through 8 or 10 or 12 incident management teams or more. I think we had, 6 or 8 different kind of cost share fires going at any given time, and trying to manage all of those through the course of the summer. And we didn't even have it as bad as the folks in Central Oregon. And it was 2 or 3 times as bad there. And they just had a lot more fire on the landscape and a lot more incidents that they're tracking. And when you're rolling 2 or 3 or 4 teams through an incident, it adds up quick, and obviously to the tune of $320 million for the state of Oregon this year. So my recommendation is to try to keep it simple and try to take care of the folks that are doing the finances, because they're the ones literally that are still working today and next month and for the next 6 months trying to sort all this stuff out. So fire season's over for us ops folks, but it's not over for the finance folks.
Good shout out there. I can agree with that. I do see that Eric put in there Viper, that's a virtual incident procurement for equipment that the Forest Service does. They also do a little bit of things for like UTVs and porta potties, hand wash, that kind of stuff. And DNR has statewide agreements also. And there is an incident business section that's coming up. I think it's tomorrow-ish, that I believe we'll delve into cost shares a little more. Yeah. But happy to talk about cost shares anytime. I review all of them for BLM, and there were a lot last year.
Yeah. Well, sorry for jumping the gun on some of that stuff, but
No
it all kind of
worries.
fits into the budget side of things, right? And just yeah, I think I covered the big points that I wanted to hit there. If folks did have questions, I will. The last thing I will say is it's all subject to change, because our fire funding in the state of Oregon has been a challenge for the last several years. Is maybe an understatement. And our legislature is meeting as we speak, and trying to solve the large fire funding problem for the state of Oregon. So we could have a new system that rolls out on July 1, which is right in the middle of fire season. Our fiscal year starts July 1 and ends June 30th. So if there's any big changes, we're going to be trying to get those thought out and implemented, probably this summer, July 1. So it's going to be, could be a lot different this fire season, just based on that. So I think that's it for me, Ed.
All right. Do we have any other questions out there for Glenda or Matt? All right, hearing none. Thanks, both of you. And yes, the incident business section's on Thursday, where we do dive in more into that cost share portion and some of those suppression costs and stuff like that do occur on the incident. So we'll definitely be discussing that more in depth on Thursday. So right now, let's go ahead and take a break. Let's go until 40 after. Let's go with the 14-minute break here, and then we'll continue on. So be back at 40 after, please.